I want to welcome everyone to the virtual world here tonight as we are in it for this program. My name is Jeff Futch. I'm the Western Regional Supervisor, or supervise the Western Office of the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources here in Asheville. And I welcome again everybody to that's coming in and attending. We really appreciate it. And I hope that you find the time certainly well spent and informative. I believe you will. We're honored to have as our speaker today, Dr. Steve Nash, and I'll introduce him a little bit more and turn the program over to him in just a little bit. But before I do that, there's a couple of things I wanted to mention. First of all, this is the first of 5 programs that we currently have scheduled, virtual programs that will be happening in February and in March. We have the one today, of course. We also have on February the 22nd, Dr. Joseph Fox from here in Asheville is going to talk about the Buncombe County Remembrance Project. And all of these are at 6:30. We'll start at 6:30, and more registration information and all that will be sent out as we move forward. But Dr. Fox will be with us on February the 22nd, which I believe is a Tuesday. I will mention that he also will be speaking, I believe I'm right on this, on February the 24th on the same topic with the Western North Carolina Historical Association. So if you are unfortunate enough to not be able to attend or busy on the 22nd, you could catch Dr. Fox in that program for the most part on the 24th with Western North Carolina Historical Association. On March the 10th, we're going to have Dr. Nash back with us again. He will be talking about the Ku Klux in Western North Carolina on that date, on March the 10th. And then on March 17th, Earl Imes, who is the curator of the African-American Collections Curator down at the Museum of History in Raleigh, will be with us on March the 17th. And Earl is the curator of an exhibit that is at the Western office right now, called Freedom, a Promise, or I guess it was a Promise Disrupted, which looks at African Americans in North Carolina during the Reconstruction period. It was at the Museum of History in Raleigh back in 2019 for about the whole year. And it is now going around to some of our locations, some of our sites, including here in Asheville. That exhibit will be open at the Western office on February the 16th and will run from February 16th through March 31st. The hours, public hours, will be 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Wednesday through Saturday. And I will be putting more information about that, as well as some other things in the chat as the program goes. So don't feel like you need to scribble all this down necessarily. But I will, include some of that information in the chat box. You can kind of look at that as Dr. Nash does his program this evening. And then last program we have right now scheduled is March the 31st, when Dr. Dan Pierce, UNCA history professor, and Ashley Weidel, who works in the Special Collections Department at UNCA, will talk about the rail project, the Railroad and Incarcerated Laborers Memorial Project, which is seeking to recognize and memorialize the African Americans who died in the construction of the railroad from Old Fort up to Asheville, up to the top of Old Fort Mountain there, going into Black Mountain. Some of you may have heard about that program or that project already. And again, I'll put some information in the chat box about that, and you can check that out a little bit later. Also, housekeeping, wanted to just mention, please, you could use the Q&A if you have a question. You're also welcome to use the chat as well, but encourage you to use the question and answer option on the program there on the screen. We will, Dr. Nash will certainly, between the two of us, we'll kind of keep a watch on that and try to make sure that we've answered all the questions, or have attempted to answer all the questions at the end of the program. So please make use of that. We'd encourage you to. And then I wanted to also mention really quickly that we are recording the program. A copy of that or link to it could be made available if you'd like to get that at a later date and might want to listen again. It'll also be up on our Department of Natural and Cultural Resources YouTube channel is where that will be located. So with that, we will move along here and let Dr. Nash talk, because you came here to listen to him and not me. So Dr. Steve Nash is an associate professor of history at East Tennessee State University, just over the hill. He earned his master's degree in history from Western Carolina University in 2001 and his PhD from the University of Georgia in 2009. He's the author of Reconstruction's Rugged Edge, The Politics of Post-War Life in the Mountain South, that came out in 2016. And among several other things, he also serves as president of the Mountain History and Culture Group, which is a nonprofit support group for the Zebulon B. Vance Birthplace State Historic Site in Buncombe County, just right next to Weaverville. So we welcome Dr. Nash, and thank you so much for your time this evening, and I will turn this over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with everybody virtually tonight. I will sort of say one of the wonderful things about virtual presentations is being able to do talks from my own home. The virtual background that you see behind me is actually my campus office, which is really messy, but I got tired of doing virtual talks at home and being on panels with people where they had all their books and things behind them and it looked very professional. And if I were to take my virtual background down, you would see that I basically have to do all my virtual talks from my kids' playroom. So, you know, such is public and academic discourse during a global pandemic. But it's wonderful to be here. It's really exciting to be able to talk with everybody about Reconstruction, and specifically Reconstruction in Western North Carolina. The title from my talk, Between Slavery and the Want of Railroads, Reconstruction in Western North Carolina, is actually kind of a throwback to what I wanted my book to be titled. So I promised myself that when I changed the title for the book to what the press and I agreed on, that I would continue to use this one as the sort of public talk title, because Between Slavery and the Want of Railroads really kind of encapsulates what Reconstruction in Western North Carolina was about. That this was the period between the end of slavery and the challenges created by the Civil War and the sort of changes wrought by emancipation, and the region's struggle with the development of infrastructure connecting it to the regional and national market economy. So I want to start by sort of reiterating something that was in the release for the talk, which was that Reconstruction is one of the most misunderstood periods in American history. That a lot of that could be talking about titles. A lot of that can be drawn from the way that historians have titled their works traditionally. One of the more sort of famous within a particular early 20th century school of Reconstruction thought was the tragic era, right? The tragic era. And in a lot of ways, I find that when I talk to people just around about Reconstruction, there's this perception of Reconstruction as being just that, tragic. That the aftermath of the Civil War, the destruction wrought by the Civil War, but also when the historians who called it the tragic era, what they were also referring to was the end of slavery. The idea that in the aftermath of the war, there was this sort of social and political and economic disruption, and that in their eyes, in their views, these historians of the early 20th century said that Reconstruction was sort of a crime, that it was tragic that African Americans and these lower class whites would band together and sort of seize power and take control over southern states, former Confederate states, away from the traditional white elite. A lot of that idea has in academia been challenged for a long time. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the very first to vocally challenge that interpretation. others have challenged that interpretation all the way up to the present day, to the point where the idea that Reconstruction was this tragic era has perhaps shifted only in the sense that instead of viewing it now as a crime, to take the subtitle of Eric Foner's magisterial revisionist history of Reconstruction, that it was not a tragic era, but rather an unfinished revolution. But one of the things also is to recognize how that played out in different sections, that Reconstruction is broadly about two things. First, African-American citizenship and freedom, the destruction of the institution of slavery, which was like a sort of monster that had tentacles reaching into every aspect of American life in the antebellum period. The destruction of that institution creates a myriad of issues about what the next step, what the future will look like. So defining African-American citizenship, what their freedom meant, is a key part, if not the biggest part, of the Reconstruction story. The other key part is the restoration of the Union, the return of the Confederate States into the Union. But underneath those two big issues, how Reconstruction as a process played out differently in different sections. And for that, I want to kind of set up by using a couple maps. I like maps. I hope you all like maps as well. If I can get my, now why is this not, there we go. Why do I have this bad feeling I'm going to start jumping multiple slides? So here's my first one, right? This is a map of dissent in the North and the South during the Civil War. As you can see, this map has a variety of different codes, and I like this map. Don't misconstrue what I'm about to say in sort of criticizing and critiquing this map. I like this map because it shows in a lot of ways how far Civil War history has gone, right? That rather than just maps of battles and geographic, right, we're going to attempt to map loyalties and dissent and conflict, internal conflict, not just in the Confederacy, but also in the North. And you can see sort of markers here for draft riots, Copperhead sentiment, which was sort of anti-war sentiment in the United States. But then here's the sort of old tried and true, which is when you look down there sort of at almost at the center, just off to the right of the center, you see that sort of blue shaded section along the border between East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, saying that these are areas of Unionist support, right? Areas where Unionists, people who remained loyal to the United States, were sizable population within the civilian population at the time of the Civil War. And certainly in East Tennessee, and notably Northeast Tennessee, this is critical. There were more civilians arrested for quote unquote disloyalty in Northeast Tennessee than any other section of the Confederacy. Western North Carolina, which is here shaded just as blue as East Tennessee, was more complicated. In fact, as my doctoral advisor, John Insko, and his co-author, Gordon McKinney, have proven, Western North Carolina was in the preponderance of pro-Confederate region. They were in preponderance of pro-Confederate region. So here we have this sort of long-standing notion, and it's a perception that's been out there for a long time, that Appalachia, Southern Appalachia, was overwhelmingly Unionist. And yet that's not true, right? It's not true. There is a sizable Unionist population here, but it wasn't overwhelmingly Unionist. Certainly not, as this map would sort of say, suggesting there was this major sort of pocket of disloyalty, if you will, to the Confederacy. So I want to start with this map and this image, right? The idea that Western North Carolina was Unionist during the Civil War, that they were opposed to the Confederacy or opposed to secession and remained loyal to the United States. The other maps that I want to use that speak to sort of similar perceptions have to deal with the concentration of the institution of slavery and the expansion of the institution of slavery. So these are a couple maps that I've taken from a Civil War textbook authored by a number of historians called This Terrible War. And this map purports to show concentration of enslaved people. Each one of those diamonds represents 2,000 enslaved people. And this is in 1820. And this is in 1820. And you can see that it's heavily concentrated along the Atlantic coast states, specifically Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. You can see it's starting to expand into Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, little pocket there in central Tennessee. I love using these maps in classes because it shows concentration of enslaved people, but also those shaded areas, those darker shaded areas, represent major cotton growing areas of the southern United States. And the next map that I'm going to show you, so this is 1820, this is 1860. And what you can see here, which is obvious, is that hand in hand, cotton production and enslavement have grown exponentially. It's spread broadly. And for our purposes here, to connect to the map with loyalty, these are wonderful maps for teaching students about how slavery was expanding during the antebellum period of the United States rather than sort of shrinking, right? The notion that slavery, if left alone, would eventually go away. Clearly, that's not happening, right? In the 40 years from 1820 to 1860, it has grown massively. But the other thing that is really important for my topic here today is if you all know, right? If you look along sort of the section that is Appalachia, right? Southern Appalachia, and you look at Western North Carolina there, right along the Tennessee border, this map would lead you to believe that there were no enslaved people in Western North Carolina, which is another popular perception. These two things go hand in hand. It's almost as widely believed and reflexive when you talk to people as to think, well, during the Civil War, Western North Carolina was Unionist. And then the second part of this, right, this sort of pernicious myth that slavery didn't exist in the region. And these maps kind of would lead people to think that way, right? That Western North Carolina was overwhelmingly loyal to the Union and that slavery was not a significant part of the region's history. So this leads me to Reconstruction, right? Because if the idea is that this is a region that's overwhelmingly loyal to the United States, or where slavery is not a central part of their existence, then what about Reconstruction? This period that is, as I said in the very beginning, almost at its core about freedom, right? And specifically freedom for African Americans, former enslaved people. How does this region experience that process? Well, for starters, let me sort of dispel one notion here, which is that slavery was very much part of life in Western North Carolina. Here's a county level map that appeared in my book that shows concentration by percentage and shading where enslaved people were located in the region. You can see Buncombe County right there, smack in the middle, right about 20%. You can see heavier concentrations, 21 to 28%, Rutherford, McDowell, Burke. Caldwell, right again, that 14 to 21. But it touched every county in the region in some way, shape, or form. Now, across the region, the population, that enslaved population across Western North Carolina was about 14%. It was about 14% as a whole. So that is total percentage, but you can see it was much larger in specific counties, right? Particularly influential counties, right? In 1860, the Western North Carolina Railroad is only as far as Morganton in Burke County. Buncombe County with Asheville is very much connected economically to East Tennessee, South Carolina, and Georgia, thanks to the Buncombe Turnpike. So we can see the sort of coming, right? The economic ties to issues here. Slavery is very much part of this life, part of this society. But the scale is important, right? As one of my professors when I was at Western Carolina once told me, right? Every place is unique. The question is how you make sense of that. So Western North Carolina has a lot in common with the rest of the South, but there's also some important, unique aspects about the Reconstruction experience I'm going to talk about today. But make no mistake, Western North Carolina, like the rest of the former Confederacy, dealt with issues of race, loyalty, federal power, and an expanding national market economy during Reconstruction. How those things played out, though, are shaped by the local realities. Enslaved people, African American population was smaller than, say, in the Deep South and the Cotton Belt. There were more unionists here in Western North Carolina than, say, coastal, right? Certainly coastal South Carolina or Mississippi. So what I want to talk about is the way that the struggle to reconstruct the mountains of counties of Western North Carolina demonstrate the complex relationships between national policies, national goals, the restoration of the Union, the definition of freedom for formerly enslaved people, and grassroots realities, the conditions on the ground. And to that, I'm going to start with this individual. I'm going to suspect that many people in the audience know exactly who this person is. This is Sarah Gudger, a former woman who was enslaved by the Hemphill family, who was living in McDowell County. In the 1930s, Sarah Gudger was interviewed by a white interviewer for the Works Progress Administration, which was one of those New Deal programs that put people to work. And they went around interviewing people who lived and were enslaved in the United States. And Sarah Gudger is a wonderful source and a unique voice in many ways. One of which is that at the time that she gave the interview, and there's been some discussion about this and some conversation about this, but at the time she gave her interview, she was in excess of 100 years old. I believe that's pretty accepted. And that makes her unique because a lot of the interviewees were children at the time that they were enslaved. Sarah Gudger was an adult. She was older than most. Her recollections of slavery were different in that regard. And in sort of talking about the sort of moment of emancipation, Sarah Gudger was pretty direct. She was pretty clear about what was going on. And her interview, which is widely available, you can find it online and read it for yourself. Her interview is very emotional. Now, with the recollection of somebody who has had a long and full life, there is a sort of sense of, humor that also sort of plays through it, that she has a sort of, a laugh at her sort of conversation about emancipation, because she says that her former enslaver, William Hemphill, basically came out and called all the African Americans on his property together and basically told them, "You are now free." And like a lot of enslavers sort of expected, right? Everybody's just going to disperse. They're going to take off. And they didn't. Sarah didn't. They stayed. And she sort of, you can sort of read her laughter at this, that he was kind of befuddled by it, right? Why would they not just take off? Well, Sarah explains. One of the reasons why, where were they going to go? Right? Where are you going to go? Like one of the things that you can certainly talk about is movement, right? And a lot of enslaved people, when emancipation comes, whether that came during the war when the Union Army arrived, or after the war, after the Confederacy collapsed, a lot of them did leave. And a lot of people came into Asheville, right? Asheville's population is going to grow. A lot of African Americans left the region, went elsewhere. But the majority of them stayed. And one of the reasons why they stayed, amongst many, was in Western North Carolina, you don't have the transportation routes, perhaps, to get out. The Buncombe Turnpike, but if you're off the Buncombe Turnpike, there aren't as many ways to move elsewhere. Asheville is the largest town in the region. And at that time, Asheville is only, I think, about 1,200, 1,400 people. Asheville isn't going to hit the US Census description of an urban place, which is 2,500 people or more, until about 1881, I believe. So, right, where are you going to go? Where are your opportunities? And more to the point, like, those are their homes, right? They've been living on those sort of farms with their community, with their families for a long time. So Sarah just kind of laughed, like this expectation that they were all going to just take off and go. Well, a lot of them were going to stay, see what happened. There's also the possibility that if they left, they could face violent reprisals, or they might not find jobs. So they stayed. They played it safe and cautious to see what opportunities would arrive. And Sarah's recollection of William Hemphill's reaction, she's laughing at him. But more than that, Sarah's sort of testimony tells us other things. One of which is that she wanted, as many formerly enslaved people wanted, is they wanted an education, right? They wanted an education. They wanted to go to school. Sarah recalled an older enslaved person from her youth making the comment that without education, freedom was meaningless. That without an education, freedom would be meaningless. And Sarah recalled that in her older age and talked about wanting to go to school. And for African Americans across the South, in the wake of emancipation, when getting educated was illegal prior to that point, they went to school passionately in large numbers. Schools popped up across the region, as we'll talk about a little bit. So Sarah wanted an education. Talking about freedom, as this exhibit that Jeff in the Western office have, right? Talking about freedom and the meaning of freedom. To Sarah and to formerly enslaved people across the South, education was a pillar of freedom. And let's even just think about that practically. If you're going to go to work, right? If you're going to sign contracts, fill out legal documents, education is essential. You want to be able to read what you're signing, not just for self-improvement, that's a huge part of it, the pride that comes from education, but also the practical elements. Sarah also spoke about family, wanting to be reunited with her family. That was a huge aspect of what African Americans defined freedom as in the wake of the Civil War. Of course, under slavery, families were not legally protected, and they could be divided by sale, or was also very common in Western North Carolina, is that they could just be divided by location. Related families in the region would often separate enslaved people, not by sale, but by location. That maybe the Henrys in one section of the county with the Loves in another section, or one section of the region, the Loves in another section of the region, would be sharing and sort of passing enslaved people back and forth so that they would separate families that way. Sarah wanted to be with her family. And she recalled in her interview in what was probably about the 1850s or so of being denied the opportunity to go see her mother when her mother was deathly ill and in fact proved to be on her deathbed. And Sarah recalled the raw emotion. It is wrenching to read about her being denied the possibility to go see her mother before her mother died. So one of the things that Sarah tells us is that when she was freed, as soon as she was able, she went to live with her father, that she wanted to be reunited with her family. So African American former enslaved people in the wake of the Civil War and emancipation, as Sarah Goddard tells us, and as their actions show us, they had a lot of the same goals, a lot of the same aspirations as formerly enslaved people across the South. Education, reuniting families, movement, being able to go where they wanted to go, the idea that they wanted access to land. And of course, they wanted their rights. They wanted the ability to have their rights secured. African Americans, that's their understanding of freedom, right? That's what they're going to be working for, striving for in the wake of the Civil War. White former Confederates in Western North Carolina, and whites in Western North Carolina, of course, had their own ideas of freedom in the wake of the Civil War. I'm going to highlight a couple people here, one of which you see Walter Lenoir, Walter Waitsstill Lenoir up in Caldwell County, and then William and Cornelia Henry here of Buncombe County over in the sort of Sulphur Springs, Hominy Valley area. Walter Lenoir is kind of a tragic figure. He got married in the 1850s. His wife gave birth to a child. The child died shortly after childbirth, and then not long after his baby daughter, I believe, died. His wife died. He would never remarry, even though he came from a well-to-do, established landholding and enslaving family. Fort Defiance, if you're familiar with the state, not the state historic site, but with the sort of privately run historic site up in Caldwell County near Lenoir. Fort Defiance, that's Walter Lenoir's family's sort of ancestral. That's where his grandfather originally settled. Walter Lenoir benefited from slavery. His family in 1860, when you add up his father's estate and his brother's holdings and his family, they enslaved 73 people in 1860. Walter was a Confederate. He volunteered for the Confederate Army, and at Ox Hill in 1862, a United States sharpshooter would shoot him in the leg, and he would lose part of his leg, believe right below the knee or right about the knee. So Walter would come tramping home after his wounding, make use of a prosthetic leg for the rest of his life. And he would live quite a while after the Civil War. And that's where Walter in some ways gets really interesting in the conversation about Reconstruction, because the Lenoir family and their relatives were in a position where they experienced emancipation and pushed back against African-American definitions of freedom. Walter, when he was living on his family's land in Haywood County after the Civil War, basically said to the enslaved people, now freed former enslaved people, that they could stay on his land and continue to work for him, but that he would offer them no terms other than those that they had previously worked under. In other words, Walter said to the former enslaved people, the now free African Americans, that you can stay and you can keep working, but you can only work for me if you continue to labor under the same conditions as slavery. Not surprisingly, the enslaved people on his land did not accept those terms. They left. And this is interesting in the sense that, first of all, one of the Lenoir family enslaved people, his name was Andy, was literate. And we do have some letters that Andy wrote to the Lenoir family pre-Reconstruction. I haven't seen any during Reconstruction. But Walter told Andy, you can stay, but it'll be under the same terms as slavery. And Andy refused. He left. But what was interesting about this is Walter's sort of line in the sand, and that when Andy left, Walter gave him what sort of amounted to severance. He gave him some farm implements, he gave him some seed and some food, and basically let him go. And in Walter's words, that was kind of him washing his hands of the whole responsibility. Andy moved not far away in Haywood County to live with some other former Lenoir family enslaved people. But what Walter also says in the aftermath of emancipation, in talking about Western North Carolina, speaks to a key aspect of emancipation, which is labor. And historians have long argued that what replaces slavery, and we're well aware that what replaces slavery is going to be sharecropping, right? Sharecropping, which is essentially an uneven compromise in which African-American laborers get some control over their labor. Certainly African-American men, as now contracted heads of household, get control over their families in terms of how their family is going to work. Whites retain the land, the most valuable form of property now. They retain control over the land, and they get to dictate in many ways what crops the African-American sharecroppers will grow. Well, one of the things that the Lenoir family makes clear is that there was a long-standing tradition of hiring white workers as sharecroppers during the antebellum period. The Lenoir family and their properties in Caldwell County, Wilkes County, Haywood County, and their sort of broad affiliated related families, had employed a wide number of white tenant sharecroppers. And Walter made the observation in the wake of emancipation, when he was basically drawing this line in the sand to formerly enslaved people, and said, you can stay on the same terms as heretofore, or you can leave. And they chose to leave. He was happy about that because, as he says, there was more white labor available in Western North Carolina that could replace African-American labor, right? The Lenoir family had been using white sharecroppers in Western North Carolina for decades. And that's exactly what Walter turned to. He hired whites under tenant agreements to work his land in Haywood County. So one of the key elements here about the transition to emancipation is that sharecropping had a long history in the region, and it actually comes quickly to the region. There was already practice. So even white former enslavers who are going to contract with African Americans and use sharecropping, they've been sharecropping with whites for a long time. This came pretty easily. Even Walter's brother, Thomas Isaac Lenoir, who also lived in Haywood County, that's what he did. He started employing sharecropping contracts with African Americans quickly after the war. Same sort of contract, same sort of idea of things that they had been doing with whites in the region for a long time. Now, Cornelia and William Henry speak to a slightly different experience, and particularly I want to talk about Cornelia. I'm going to move sort of inside the household and talk about how labor impacted women in the wake of emancipation. In July of 1865, Cornelia Henry, who kept a wonderful diary, which has been published under the title of Fear in North Carolina, you should certainly check it out if you've never seen it. It is a marvelous diary. Cornelia Henry wrote in her diary in July of 1865 that she had recognized a change in her former enslaved people. Talking about emancipation and the destruction of the institution of slavery, Cornelia says, quote, "This is a peace we little expected and did not want." And that former enslaved people, quote, "seem not to want to do anything other than only as they are hired." Pretty telling quote. They're only going to do what they've been hired to do. The tasks that they used to do under slavery, all the related tasks, all the sort of additional things that would just get tagged on and added on and sort of expected, that changed. As she says, they will only do what they have been hired to do, what they have been contracted to do. And within Cornelia's household, where Cornelia was sort of the mistress of the household, her diary gives us great insight into African American women's labor and patterns during Reconstruction and in the wake of emancipation. Women, African American women, in the wake of the Civil War, in the wake of emancipation, seemed to come and go from the Henry household frequently and at will. Several formerly enslaved women left the Henrys in 1865. A mobility that Cornelia underscored in her diary in repeated entries. One formerly enslaved woman by the name of Jenny was fired by Cornelia Henry in July of 1866 for quote unquote being insolent. Well, when Jenny was fired, she didn't leave by herself. Other enslaved women, probably related to Jenny, went with her. Harriet left. Dub left. Dub had served as the Henry's cook for some time. But when Jenny left, she and Harriet left with her. There's a pattern through Cornelia's diary from 1865 to 1868 that shows this coming and going of African American women, presumably coming when it suited them and leaving equally when it suited them. Often, as was the case with Jenny, with their families in tow. So it wasn't long before Cornelia and her family attempted to do what Walter Lenoir advised, which was to turn to white labor. And in 1867, July of 1867, the Henrys hired Dave Luther and his wife to come work in the Henry household. And yet, a month later, Cornelia records the Luthers quit and left. This pattern of rapid turnover continued through 1868. A former enslaved person from the Henry family, Tempa, returned, worked for a short time, and then left for Tennessee. A new cook was hired, and lasted a whole day before she left. Finally, Cornelia Henry, in the spring of 1868, would record in her diary that for the very first time, she cooked a meal for her entire family by herself. This coming and going of African American workers within the Henry household, this coming and going of African Americans throughout the region, right, demonstrates the fluidity. Their understanding of freedom meant that they could move, they could go looking for different jobs. They would look out for their families, they would come and go on contracts as it sort of deemed, as it fit their goals. For whites like Lenoir or the Henrys, this didn't make sense, right? This was completely foreign to them, that this is how things would function from here on out. They thought that they could more or less return to the antebellum status quo. This turbulence, this transition in the sort of nature of society and economy required some level of management. The federal government recognized this, and they created what was popularly known as the Freedmen's Bureau, or the Bureau of Freedmen, Abandoned Lands, and Freedmen, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands. Refugees, Freedmen, Abandoned Lands. Freedmen's Bureau. What I like about this map, and you'll have to probably take a moment to adjust your eyes to get a sense to it, this is a sort of modern topographical map of Western North Carolina, but this is somebody, the Mapping the Freedmen's Bureau project, who has been trying to put dots on a map for every Freedmen's Bureau office location across the South. And here you can see the Western North Carolina offices represented. As you sort of move up, if you find Morganton, or if you find Asheville, if you look to the southwest, that's Franklin. There was actually, for kind of a brief moment, a Hendersonville agent. They didn't last very long. You can see that there was an agent in Morganton. There was an agent briefly in Lenoir. The two up above that you see, sort of, you take Morganton, you sort of follow that line, imaginary line from Morganton to Lenoir and up. Those would be Wilkesboro, and then up above that would be Jefferson in Ashe County. So there were, for a time, these Freedmen's Bureau offices dotted across Western North Carolina. And this is really sort of fascinating in the sense that the Freedmen's Bureau, which is an organization that is designed largely to deal with the consequences of emancipation, right? To deal with the consequences of emancipation. What are they doing in a region where the African American population was only about 14%? And how influential could they actually be in this region? And the answer is very. They could be very influential. And the reason for that being is, as you look at this map, and this is kind of a more modern map, but it still kind of gives you a sense. In 1865, in the immediate aftermath of the war, you still have the Buncombe Turnpike and the Western North Carolina Railroad to Morganton. There is no railroad in Western North Carolina past Morganton at this point. The roads are relatively rough. In fact, one of the things that I'm continuously fascinated about is that a lot of people up in the Mitchell County region, even Yancey County and whatever, instead of coming to Asheville to conduct business or go to market, a lot of them crossed over into East Tennessee and went to Johnson City, Greenville. Greenville perhaps makes sense along the Madison County line, but they went to Jonesboro, Tennessee, not necessarily to Asheville. So you have poor roads, a rough terrain, no railroad. So, and the military has a scant presence. So the Freedmen's Bureau in Western North Carolina is the federal government, right? In Western North Carolina, the most tangible presence on the part of the federal government during Reconstruction is the Freedmen's Bureau. They came in slowly in 1865 and 1866, and I did see somebody, there was no agent in Rutherford County. Rutherford County was included within other sub-districts, particularly if you look off to the sort of east of Rutherford. So these bureau agents were essentially, they were the federal government. They had the power to intervene in court cases. When the state of North Carolina passed black codes limiting African Americans' freedom, Things like vagrancy laws, which allowed them to arrest people who didn't have jobs, who appeared to be moving sort of in the eyes of whites as sort of aimlessly. They had restrictions on African Americans' ability to testify in court. They could only testify in cases that involved other Black people, not cases that involved white people. They put restrictions on gun ownership. They put restrictions on all sorts of things. The Freedmen's Bureau became the most tangible source of federal power. And one of the things that I've found interesting about the Freedmen's Bureau is that the agents in Western North Carolina proved to be very sympathetic towards African Americans, and many of them proved to be very active. And specifically, I want to focus on the agent who was stationed in 1867-68, ultimately leaves in 1869, or at least leaves that office in 1869, a New Yorker by the name of Oscar Eastman. Oscar Eastman. Somebody can ask me afterwards in the Q&A if you want to know more about Oscar Eastman. You can carve yourself out an hour and we'll just talk nothing but Oscar Eastman for an hour afterwards. Eastman had come into North Carolina as a Union soldier during the Civil War. He ultimately is going to find his way out to Asheville in 1867. He's appointed as a civilian agent. He had a pulmonary sort of chronic ailment. And I believe that in some ways, Eastman thought that moving out to Asheville was going to be good for his health. I think he thought that coming out to the mountains was going to be healthy and that this would be a good spot for him. So Eastman comes out and immediately gets involved in what's going on out here. African Americans, white unionists, find out that Oscar Eastman is very sympathetic. Oscar Eastman is intervening in court cases. He gets involved in a court case involving an African American man named Cammie Spears. In the process, royally upsets and frustrates Judge Augustus Merriman and solicitor David Coleman. Coleman and Merriman had seen Spears convicted for a crime, for a theft carried out in the last days of the war. They convicted him on the testimony of the best men of the county. Eastman intervened and said that this was an unfair trial because Spears wasn't allowed to testify in his own behalf. And his investigation, Eastman's investigation, proved that this was a trumped up case. And it probably also didn't help Merriman's case in claiming that this was completely impartial when they made a deal to allow Cammie Spears to avoid conviction and time in the penitentiary by hiring out his labor to none other than Augustus Merriman's brother-in-law, a man by the name of Nat Atkinson. So Eastman intervenes in this case. He gets Spears sent free. He gets involved in other cases. He gets involved in labor contracts. He helps to facilitate African American schools in Buncombe County and surrounding counties. Same happens in the other districts. They're getting involved in all sorts of things. And it becomes pretty clear that the Freedmen's Bureau is sympathetic federal power. And politically, this has cachet. This has meaning because whites across the board, Unionist or Confederate, both sort of agree that African Americans should not enjoy a significant change in their status. There was one white Unionist running for state office in the aftermath of the Civil War in 1865 who says that the solution to emancipation is colonization of African Americans out of the country. By 1867, 1868, they're singing a new tune. They are telling African Americans that if their employers are not dealing fairly with them, to go to the Freedmen's Bureau. And oh yeah, by the way, after March of 1867, vote Republican. This is a twist. The Unionists of Western North Carolina have become Republicans. They've aligned themselves with a national party that defends African American civil rights. And the Freedmen's Bureau is this sort of bridge in this region where the federal power can be used to support whites, and it can also be used to protect African Americans. And this is going to get me into some of the political aspects of this. If my wonderful handy dandy clicker, there we go. African Americans, before the 15th Amendment guaranteeing African American men the right to vote, African Americans began voting in 1867 in state elections. This is a colorized version of a very popular image that was in Harper's Weekly of African Americans registering to vote in Asheville. And they began registering in 1867 to participate in state elections in 1868. And the Freedmen's Bureau was put in charge of this registration. The Freedmen's Bureau would convene and create biracial local boards of election for every county. And then those boards of election would register people to vote. And then in 1868, African Americans went to the polls for the first time in North Carolina's history. And they had a significant impact. Here is the registration of voters in 1867-68. I underscored Buncombe just as an example, but you can see 81%, 81.5% of the electorate, registered electorate, were white, 18.5%, which is about what the percentage of the population was. It's comparable. 18.5% of the registered electorate were African American. You can see across the region as a whole, there at the bottom, percentage of electorate, 86.4% were white in the region as a whole, 13.6%. Again, roughly comparable to population composition. And you can see some of these counties are broadly and overwhelmingly white. Take, for instance, Watauga County, right, up where Boone is. Watauga County, 95.6% white registered electorate, 4.4% African American. Why am I telling you all this? Because the Republicans sweep in 1868 in the state. They enact a new constitution, which, by the way, is still the North Carolina State Constitution, amended partly. But the Republican candidate, William Holden, wins. And in Western North Carolina, he got 54.9% of the vote. In Buncombe County, which again I underscored there, he got 54.5% of the vote. You scroll down, Watauga County, he got 50.4% of the vote. This is going to be significant in a second. Why is this significant? Because historians have long recognized that in areas where the region is going to break out into violence, these were areas that were typically areas that the African American population was roughly equal or larger than the white population. But Western North Carolina doesn't fit that mold. But what we can see, and let me preface this by telling you that my mom taught me when I was a kid that what happens when you assume, right? But it is well documented, the enthusiasm that African American voters had for the Republican Party, right? The party of Lincoln, the party of emancipation. It is well documented, the enthusiasm that African Americans had for Republican politics during Reconstruction. If African Americans voted in significant number in Buncombe County in 1868, they provided the margin of victory for the Republican. William Holden wins the county by just over 400 votes, right? Or no, just over 200 votes. If African Americans, if half of the registered African Americans voted for Holden, they tipped the balance. In Watauga County, African Americans were only 36 registered voters. Watauga County had only 36 registered Black voters. Holden won the county by 5 votes, right? I'm going to guess, again, I credit my mom. I know what happens here, but I'm going to guess that there were at least 5 African Americans who voted for Holden in Watauga County. African Americans were a pivotal swing vote in important Western North Carolina counties. They were a critical, if not indispensable, part of the Republican coalition. And that caught the attention of their conservative white neighbors, which precipitated the creation of a counter-revolutionary terrorist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan originated, of course, in Tennessee, grew and evolved and morphed in a variety of different ways to the point that it was emerging in 1867 and 1868 as a violent sort of terrorist wing of the Southern conservative political party which had various names in different states. In North Carolina at that time, they were just called the Conservative Party. As far as I can tell, the Reconstruction Era Ku Klux Klan had entered into Western North Carolina about April of 1868. That's where the item that you see on your right, which looks like a sketched out coffin, that's where that came from. That threat was posted on a warning given to an African-American carpenter and a U.S. Internal Revenue Bureau tax collector, both in Waynesville. And it was passed on to Oscar Eastman, the agent in Asheville, who then passed it on to federal officials up the chain. And I'll read it to you because the language of the letters are a little bit. It says, Baker's Tomb, Western Division, windy month, cloudy day, bloody hour. Ku Klux Klan, the hour approacheth. Shake up dry bones and meet on the mysterious circle of the hollow sphere. From east and west, from north and south, we come to measure justice for the traitor's doom. When darkness reigns, then is the hour to strike. Again, Mom, I know what happens when I assume. But I believe, given the epithet given to Republicans by Southerners as Black Republicans, I believe that when darkness reigns, then is the hour to strike is a reference to African American political power and the rise of the Republicans to win state office in 1868. The Ku Klux Klan believed that this federal power built upon a biracial political coalition was illegitimate. They believed that African Americans were given civil rights and voting rights at a time where many leading former Confederates could not vote, that this was unjust. They questioned the legitimacy of these elections. They questioned the legitimacy of organizations like the Freedmen Bureau, and they took that to a degree of violent resistance. Perhaps the most famous being an election riot that happened in Asheville in November of 1868. During the presidential and congressional elections, there was a riot. This is a news clipping reporting the riot in the Wilmington Daily Journal on November 11th of 1868. If you read through it, it is a very conservative, capital C, conservative party version of the events. I don't have enough time to go into great detail about the election riot in 1868. Somebody asked me about it in the Q&A afterwards. The reality was that the riot appears to have been a Ku Klux Klan response to political power shifting towards white and Black Republicans. And violence would follow and continue. In 1869, a Republican prosecutor who was leading investigations into the Ku Klux Klan, a man by the name of Virgil Lusk, was caned by the founder of the Asheville Citizen, a Ku Klux leader by the name of Randolph Shotwell in Pack Square. William Brooks, an African-American man, was attacked in the middle of the night up along the Yancey County, Buncombe County border. William Brooks tried to hide under the bed to avoid a violent clash with Ku Klux. His wife was being attacked, which led him to come out from under the bed brandishing an axe. He buried the axe into the back of one of the Klansmen, and then as the others fled, he threw the axe at the others. This was reported and talked about by leading conservatives in Asheville who wrote about it with disbelief, not imagining that something like this actually could happen. Federal testimony shows that it did. Aaron Biggerstaff, a unionist and controversial figure in Rutherford County, was attacked multiple times. And of course, there was a large-scale raid upon the county seat of Rutherfordton in 1871. So the Ku Klux became a violent countermeasure against Reconstruction and this biracial coalition that had emerged during Reconstruction. And it proved that violence could go a long way towards discouraging people from like Biggerstaff or others from participating in politics moving forward. The Ku Klux are a major turning point, breaking apart this biracial political coalition. But what's important about Western North Carolina is that the Ku Klux wasn't enough in its own to topple that. Instead, there had to be politics involved. And yes, I readily admit this is not a time appropriate, but bear with me, right? Western North Carolinians after the sort of violent upheaval of the Ku Klux Klan through the early 1870s, start looking for ways to kind of stitch back together. The conservatives are going to impeach the Republican governor, William Holden, in 1871. His impeachment was led by Klansmen, prosecuted by Klansmen. It's a problematic event. Again, we can talk about it in the Q&A. But afterwards, Republicans, whites in the Republican Party and whites in the Conservative Party began to look for ways to kind of move forward, right? And one of them is to get back to the economics of the region. Come visit the land of the sky, hat tip to Richard Starnes, right? Tourism. The tourism industry is a significant way of sort of reviving the economy. But you need to be able to get people in, right? There's boosters, people writing about the region, talking about the benefits of coming to Western North Carolina. They want to get people in. This is one argument again for why the railroad would need to be completed. Another argument for why the railroad would need to be completed is that there was a tobacco boom in the 1870s in Western North Carolina. Bright leaf tobacco is going to become the region's staple crop in the 1870s. And it booms. It absolutely booms. Tobacco production in one county, in Madison, Buncombe County, sort of moves from about 25,000 pounds per year to more than 1 million pounds of tobacco produced annually. That is a massive shift in a region that previously had not had a major staple crop outside of, if we're going to talk about cattle or corn or hogs. So this sort of twin boom of wanting to booster the region, revive tourism, they're promoting agriculture, right? Tourism or tobacco is promoting agriculture. They're promoting the idea of a new South in the Western mountains based upon a sort of old South crop. And they're selling people on the idea that in order to really maximize the potential of tobacco, that they have to have quicker and better access to markets. Whites across the political spectrum are starting to come back together, compromising issues like African-American civil rights and freedom to move towards this idea of prosperity, turning their backs on issues of freedom to talk about commercial development. Tobacco is going to be the boom. They're going to talk about it. They're going to advertise it. Things are going to appear in papers like the experiments for several years past have shown that several of the counties in Western North Carolina are peculiarly adapted to the growth of fine leaf tobacco. Another one says that they basically had bunted the bull off the bridge, right? An idea to Bull Durham, that they had moved past sort of North Carolina Piedmont tobacco. So these twin things, right, of boosting the region, encouraging people to come here, encouraging people to visit, tobacco sells that they have to finally complete that long sort of scandal-laden railroad. And there's probably no way to sort of better underscore the sort of compromise, the shift that happens amongst whites, particularly white Republicans during this period, to talk about their change in their biracial makeup of their party, than the fact that that railroad is going to be overwhelmingly constructed by incarcerated workers. African-American men, overwhelmingly African-American men, convicted and sent to the penitentiary over often very flimsy or trumped up charges, and sent out to work as incarcerated workers in dangerous conditions, building the railroad to Asheville. Like I said, there's probably no better sort of short version of explaining just how the Republicans changed during the 1870s as they started to alter their politics and turn back towards this idea of market integration, which is a long-standing issue in the region. Infrastructure, market connections, market development, that leads them to tobacco. It leads them to boosterism. It leads them to what at the time was known as convict labor, but more accurately described as incarcerated labor, right? The sort of forced labor, again, of African-American men that made the railroad to Asheville possible. So to kind of bring us back around, I kind of want to come back to this map. right? The sort of 1 + 1 = 2 equation. Unionists and an absence of African Americans makes Reconstruction simple or perhaps invisible in Western North Carolina. I believe that one of the, and I like this map, but one of the problems is this map tries to make a complicated problem like wartime loyalty neat, right? It tries to visually represent it neatly. And some things can't be represented neatly. Some things are messy, dirty, violent, complicated, mixed with hope and aspiration and positivity. Reconstruction saw African American, formerly enslaved people seize their freedom. Reconstruction saw in Western North Carolina African Americans become vitally important political players, aligning with whites who were unionists or disaffected former Confederates to create a very small d democratic political movement in the region's Republican Party. But in the end, the sort of violence of the Klan and the sort of renewed appeals to a sort of white prosperity led the Republican coalition to break apart and for Reconstruction, a very messy topic, to come to an unfortunately neat end in 1880. And with that, I thank you all for your time. I tried very hard to stick to a time that I set for myself. I did not do that very well, so I apologize for running a little bit long. But at this point, I'm going to welcome any questions, comments, or things that people want to talk about.
Any questions at all? You can also click there, raise your hand, and I can unmute you if you'd like. Save you from typing. I know one of the things, Dr. Nash, you were talking about, I believe you had mentioned, was it the 1868 riot? You had said you might want to circle back around.
Sure. Yeah.
In the Q&A.
Sure. Yeah. The election riot of 1868, which happens in November, it was the congressional and presidential election. Of course, U.S. Grant was standing for election as president for the first time, and the local congressional incumbent here was a man by the name of Alexander Hamilton Jones, A.H. Jones, who was a newspaper editor who founded the Henderson Pioneer and then moved it to Asheville. He was a Republican, and sort of the long-standing view, the Asheville riot is kind of fascinating, and it had been written about in the 1970s, and there's been other people who have written about it. And it appears to have broken out over the fact that a African-American man attempted to vote in Asheville in 1868 and was told that he could not vote because of a prior criminal conviction. And he disputed that. And as he sort of, with other African Americans, sort of moved around town during election day, things increasingly appeared to be getting more heated. And there's this sort of suggestion, the sort of idea that the sort of spark was that this group of African Americans, the main sort of figure in it, I believe his name was James Smith, that the main sort of spark was that he had gotten into a fight with an African American man who wanted to vote conservative. And they got into a fight and supposedly pushed the other black men down, and this led to whites rallying in defense of the black conservative voter, and this shootout breaks out, and it's a one-sided shootout because the only people that appear to be getting shot are black men, and I believe 11 people are casualties in this, and James Smith is killed. And there's testimony about this, and a lot of this is newspaper accounts and other things. I had never really found a first-person account of the riot until a couple years ago. I was flipping through a collection of papers from an Army officer who was stationed in Western North Carolina in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. He was I think he was a Michigander, certainly up from sort of the old Northwest. And I was flipping through his papers and I found this letter from November of 1868, signed Cousin Hattie to Cousin Willie. And Cousin Willie was William Stevens, who was an Army officer who was in Western North Carolina. Hattie turned out to be Harriet Jones, which was H. Jones's daughter. When Stevens was in Western North Carolina, when he was in Asheville, he stayed for a while at the Joneses' house and evidently struck up a friendship with daughter. So Hattie wrote to William Stevens 2 weeks after the election riot. It is the closest proximity direct account that I have found of what happened in Asheville at that time. And a couple revelatory things came out of that letter, one of which is she talked about the fact that the Jones family had been stoned during the day, that her father had been hooted at and hollered and threatened during the day when he was up for election to Congress, and that James Smith, who was murdered, who was killed in the riot, had been living with the Jones family up to that time. So there was a direct connection between Republican leadership and what went down in Asheville in 1868 in that election riot. And in her letter, Harriet Jones blamed what happened in Asheville that day on the Ku Klux Klan. She said that it was a Ku Klux attack that happened during the election. Again, that is the only sort of close to the time, person on the ground letter that I have found that talks about the events that happened there. And just as a coda to that is that Jones was actually defeated in that election by a Klan leader by the name of Plato Durham, who lived in Cleveland County. They later determined that the election was fraudulent, and Durham's election was overturned, and Jones was sent back to Congress. Not long after his term, Jones is going to leave Western North Carolina and move to California. So there we go. That's the stuff I would have talked about, but I didn't get to talk about. I do see some interesting questions kind of coming in to the chat. So if I may, let me look at some of these. Interesting stuff on Walter Lenoir. I've always found Walter Lenoir very fascinating. There's a wonderful biography about him by William Barney of UNC Chapel Hill called The Making of a Confederate. If William Barney wasn't working on that book when I started my dissertation research, I very well may have written a book on Walter Lenoir. His family left really rich historical records. Was there any particular or known reason the Hendersonville office of the Freedmen's Bureau was so short-lived? The Freedmen's Bureau during that period struggled mightily for staffing. They largely leaned upon either local civilians or in the immediate aftermath of the war, they relied upon Army officers. And local civilians often didn't have much stomach for it because, as you might suspect, being a white Freedmen's Bureau agent who lived in the community, who was from the community, could make you very, very unpopular with your neighbors. Sort of referencing back to Caldwell County and the Lenoirs. There was a similar civilian agent in Lenoir for a while. He didn't last very long. He was a local Republican. Henderson County, I believe, is a similar sort of thing. There just wasn't a staffing. They ultimately left pretty quickly. And then after they redesigned the districts, Henderson was under one of the other sub-assistant commissioners. It was under Eastman out of Asheville. He had, under his jurisdiction, he had Madison, Yancey, Buncombe, Henderson, and I think Transylvania. And then as you move further east, other offices fell under the office in Morganton. And then as you move sort of off from there, there was Lincolnton and sections down that way. Were there any incidents of violence leveled at so-called carpetbaggers that relocated from the north to take part in the process of Reconstruction in Western North Carolina? Carpetbaggers, I don't see a lot and carpetbaggers, I mean, Oscar Eastman was threatened multiple times. You could easily refer him as a carpetbagger. Certainly, they would call him as such because Eastman doesn't leave Asheville. In fact, he becomes mayor of Asheville for a hot minute after he ceases to be Freedmen's Bureau agent. And then he's going to stay in the region. I've done a lot more on him, but he certainly stays in the area. He doesn't leave. In Western North Carolina, because you had so many Unionists, you had a lot of what were derisively called scalawags, which were Republicans who were native-born Southerners. Notably, people like Alexander Hamilton Jones, Virgil Lusk, and others. Robert and James Love, or not Love. Robert and James Henry were two others who were local and became Republicans. Violence towards the people I just named, well, Lusk was caned by Randolph Shotwell as a correction for his sort of hostility towards the Ku Klux Klan. There was a gentleman up in Madison County who I'll talk more about at my next talk, who came out of his home. He was a Republican, white Republican. He came out of his home and found that they had dug a grave on his property and left an open coffin there as a warning. So yes, there's violence, there's attacks on local whites. Aaron Biggerstaff in Rutherford County, James Justice in Rutherford County. But those are all men who were from Western North Carolina or from the region. Was there any incentive for emancipated people to register with the Freedmen's Bureau? The incentive was that for the first time, they had direct access to somebody backed by the federal government. The Freedmen's Bureau was not perfect, and if I crossed the border and started telling you about some of the stuff that was happening in East Tennessee, you would find Bureau agents who are not necessarily as sympathetic or activist as people like Eastman or the agent George Hawley down in Macon County, or some of the others. The incentive is that the Freedmen's Bureau could intervene in court cases. It could secure. One of the popular complaints and problems was that white landowners would not settle. They would not pay African-American workers, particularly in the end of 1865, and this problem persists. One of the sort of strategies, and you can stop me if this sounds sort of familiar, one of the strategies was that white landowners recognized that they had more money, they had more wherewithal, and they could just continue to delay court cases until African Americans just ran out of money or could no longer sustain it. And then the case would default and the white landowner would basically get away without paying wages. The Freedmen's Bureau stopped that. The Freedmen's Bureau would intervene, settle for wages, protect civil rights in court. The Freedmen's Bureau would get involved in a whole wide range of things. They even get involved in illicit distilling, if you can believe it. They get involved in that as well. So the incentive for African Americans was they had a sympathetic ally who was clothed in the power of the federal government. And let me also spin this the other way. Like, they used the Freedmen's Bureau for their purposes. Like, they didn't need the Freedmen's Bureau to tell them what they wanted. They used the Freedmen's Bureau to get it. And then allied with sympathetic whites to politically enhance their power. Why did tobacco culture suddenly explode after the Civil War? Really good question. A guy moved into the region right around Chun's Cove area, started experimenting with bright leaf tobacco, discovered that it did really well, and then he ran a really good booster campaign in the local press, was making money off of it. He had a local booster, Edward Alston, who was writing a weekly sort of piece, sort of trumpeting the benefits of Western North Carolina economically. They took it to expositions and markets in Danville, and it did really well. And it's one of those copycat cultures, right? Started making a lot of money. Everybody was doing it. Tobacco exploded. Warehouses were built in Madison County and downtown Marshall. They were built in Asheville. And the boom comes and goes pretty quickly. It's going to peter out by the 1890s before a sort of 20th century revival. But yeah, it exploded. And I guess if I were to sort of say the incentive, right, you had people looking for a way to make money. The region was economically depressed after the Civil War. Cash was in very short supply. They had the land. This is one of the things that I argue in my book, and sort of this idea about sharecropping. You know, there's a famous economic historian, labor historian of the US South, who says that after the Civil War, the South as a whole goes from a region of labor lords to a region of landlords. That, you know, in 1860, the South has roughly $4 billion. In 1860 dollars, roughly $4 billion invested in enslaved property, which is wiped out by emancipation. So what do they fall back on? They fall back on the fact that they still own the land. And they're looking for a way to make that profitable. And they found tobacco, and they went head in. They dove in deeply, and were able to sort of exploit that for economic benefit. And then I think also exploited the tobacco boom as a way of making the argument that they had to complete the railroad, because they had to get this valuable product out of the region and get it to market. Do you see any parallels in the white-black issues of this period and what is happening today in Asheville with the reparations issue? I used to teach, well, a couple of years ago, I taught a class on Reconstruction, and I started every class by telling my students that I did not plan for this topic to resonate as much as it does now. I see so many parallels between what is happening now and what was happening during Reconstruction. And the reparations issue, I think, is about justice. It's about equity. You think about all the people whose African-American people of color whose generational wealth would have been wiped out or denied due to slavery, and sort of making that sort of just, coming to an equity conclusion on that. But in thinking about Reconstruction, issues like, and I'm talking broadly now, issues like misinformation. The Ku Klux Klan was very good at convincing people that they did not exist, despite all the evidence to the contrary. Misinformation, breeding distrust, decrying your political opposition as illegitimate. The ideas of voter suppression. There's so many parallels. White supremacy, terrorist organizations. There are so many parallels between then and now that I think there's a lot that people can recognize, and recognize that Western North Carolina wasn't isolated from this. That they were very much involved, very much touched by the Civil War, very much touched by Reconstruction. But there's also, I sort of say, there's also the hope factor. I hate sometimes that, the Reconstruction guy comes across as the doom and gloom, right? The idea that there was this small d democratic biracial political coalition that was so effective, that African Americans seized their freedom, they pushed their political power, they had their voices heard. And regrettably, it wasn't sustained through the period as much, perhaps, as it could have been. But there's a lot of optimism and hope intertwined with all of this sort of chaos and everything else. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Those were great questions there at the end. And when we do these things, always look at the number of folks who joined and the number of folks who stayed, and just about everybody has stayed through the whole presentation. So we so much enjoy, or have enjoyed, the all the information, and certainly look forward to March 10th, when Dr. Nash will be back with us, and we'll talk specifically about the Ku Klux. So yeah, I really appreciate everybody's attendance. Just remember that this was recorded. So if you would like a copy, it can be made available. Just reach out to myself at the Western office. I think I've recognized a lot of the names on our attendee list there. So I'm sure folks know how to get in touch with me if they have any questions or would like to follow up. I also want to thank Matt Zaire, who helped make the webinar possible with his behind the scenes knowledge and everything that he did, so that he makes folks like Dr. Nash and myself look like we know what we're doing. So we appreciate Matt and his help. So yeah, couple of minutes here left. I really appreciate it. We look forward to the next presentation. I put hopefully some good information in the chat with some links about various things, and hopefully folks were able to make note of that. But yeah, please, if you have an interest and are in the area and would like to come to the building again, February 16th through March 31st, Wednesdays through Saturdays from 10 to 2 will be our public hours for folks to come and look at the exhibit that again was on display at the Museum of History back in 2019. Has a lot of panels and a lot of real good information on the period of time. I believe they're mainly looking at 1862 to about 1901 are the dates on that exhibit. So, well, I hope everybody has a great evening. Thank you again, Dr. Nash, for your time.
Thank you.
Yes, and I'll be in touch again soon, and we will see you next month.